So our first speaker of the afternoon is a chap called Adam Bly, and when you do this job, this sort of hosting job, obviously you look at people's biography, and Adam's got a biography which basically makes you think, what the hell have I been doing with my life for the last 20 years? Adam is a scientist, he is an entrepreneur, he is a publisher, he is a teacher, he's an advisor. He started his career when he was 16, when he was the youngest research scientist researching cancer. Now, when I was 16, I was trying to research girls fueled by cider. I'm not sure about you, but he subsequently went on to found a magazine called Seed, which I understand was like the Rolling Stone magazine for the science and culture community. He is an advisor to numerous public bodies. He goes to Davos and sits with the people who rule the world. He advises the United Nations. He is a fellow at Harvard, I understand. And he's also a very good dancer, and he likes small animals. And the main thing that he's doing, and I think he's going to talk about today, is he's CEO of a company called Seed. And Seed are a company, he'll explain all this, but who advise organizations, large and small, public and private, about how they should use, communicate, and exploit their data sets. Now, one of the things that he will talk about that I'm going to spoil by telling you now, that some of you may have experienced, is the Beats music streaming service, so the equivalent of Spotify. One of the things that Apple bought in their multi-billion-pound acquisition. And at the heart of the Beats music service is a promise, I guess, the promise to tailor a playlist, curate a playlist, personalize a playlist to you, to your music preferences, and crucially, I think, to your context at the time you listen. And if you are at all skeptical, hopefully by now, I missed today's sessions unfortunately, but hopefully by now you're not, but if you're at all skeptical about whether or not data can deliver a positive emotional engagement, then let me just tell you this very quick story about someone who first used Beats. So this is just a tweet, which I'm going to paraphrase. So essentially, it said, listening to the Beats music, crossing Brooklyn Bridge, New York, New York by Ryan Adams starts playing. Amazing. So a moment of serendipity, a magical moment created by a special source, which is essentially this algorithm, a moment of connection between your ears and your environment that could only be created through data. There's no other way that could have happened. So, with my rather long introduction done, I think Adam's going to talk more about the value of those moments, those magical moments. So please give it up for Adam.
Thank you very much. Small animals. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about that case, and I'll bring that up in a few minutes. But I kind of want to frame it within the context of a kind of broader question that I've been wrestling with over the last couple of years in particular, which is kind of framed as a value exchange for the data era. And I'll sort of lay this out over the next few minutes, what I sort of mean and why I think this is a kind of critical problem for us to wrestle with as a multi-stakeholder community who care about data and making amazing things and crafting amazing things with it. That this is really maybe the quintessential question that we need to be mindful of before we get too far ahead of ourselves and sort of lose the moment to think about the fundamentals of this kind of very transformational and exciting moment. So just by way of kind of context, so over the last 3 years or so at Seed Scientific, we've been cultivating the nexus of science, design, and engineering to try to make and solve things with data. And we've been doing this principally within the realms of advanced analytics and algorithm design, personalization and recommendation, and really using data to create what we hope are exciting, amazing products and services with data at their core. And we've worked with really an extraordinary roster of organizations in the public sector, in the social sector, in the commercial sector, and that kind of multidisciplinarity and cross-sectoral point of view allows us to kind of come to certain observations about the state of data. And it kind of maybe goes without saying to a room as forward-thinking and enthusiastic about data as this one, that this is sort of the truth. But certainly from our observations and from what we can anticipate is ahead of us over the next decade or so, we've really just kind of cracked the surface in terms of what we can now accomplish with data, both in terms of making and in terms of sort of solving kind of big problems for governments or for organizations or for companies, making amazing things for consumers or for companies. We've really just cracked the surface. And when I think about where we can go and what this promise is, this is kind of my big list of what the opportunity is. And I kind of want to start framing this within the context of value, and value that we can be creating for four big groups of stakeholders in society. And I kind of want to set this out because when you start to see this all come together, you realize that really the potential in front of us is many, many, many fold greater than where we are today. And if we really want to cultivate that, the fundamentals, again, of this moment and where we are critical. And so when I think about the value for people, this potential value for people, it really starts with relevance, and that'll be the thing that I spend the most time talking about, of how we can craft relevance for people, contextually relevant experiences, relevant to their own self, relevant to their personality, relevant to their behavior, and really create that resonance in a variety of different contexts and categories that they interact with over the course of a day. Transparency to government, having the direct sense and access to information about how things are being spent, how things are being run, has an extraordinary value to consumers, to people, as we go forward. And really smarter decisions in their own lives, whether that's healthier decisions that they can now make, whether that's more economical decisions about energy expenditures, that has an economic consequence that really affects people on a day-to-day. For companies, we are already starting to produce new insights, but maybe one of the great opportunities in front of us is that more people can be producing more insights, and that's going to be a function of advancing data literacy, a function of advancing visualization, and generally a culture of decision-making that will change over the next few years. This is a new raw material for innovation. The construction of algorithms is a new set of IP for companies to start creating value from. Greater relevance to their customers and consumers, and really a sustainable form of relevance. If you can know somebody better and really know them deeply, there's a good argument to be made that that's your most substantial competitive advantage and your most substantial moat that you can sort of create around a brand is that deep sense of relevance and that deep sense of connection. It's a new asset on the balance sheet, just in economic terms. We're starting to see companies work with their auditors to put consumer data and that asset on the balance sheet is a new multi-billion-dollar asset. So for Fortune 500 companies, the notion that this is now something that has a pretty substantial transformational impact on the company is pretty profound. New efficiencies, no need to sort of go into that here. And smarter decisions, whether that's the MIT Wharton study that shows a 5–6% increase in productivity for companies that are more data-driven as opposed to intuition-based in their decision-making. And I think that's really just scratching the surface of what that number could be. For governments and for society, we're starting to see sort of the advent of data-driven policymaking, where we can start to affect crime, we can start to affect education policy, we can start to affect public health decisions, based on a solid base of empiricism. And that's, revolutionary, right? It's sort of fundamental shift in how policy is made. We can test and react. There's even a kind of general culture that starts to manifest itself now in governments around the world that with this kind of fluidity of data and this dexterity that we have with data, we can actually be more inclined towards testing and experimenting and reacting to our policies than just waiting and putting something out there and reacting decades later to the outcome. Strengthen democracies, but greater transparency, greater participation. This is just the beginning, and we can imagine actually fundamentally kind of buttressing democracy with data. Systems thinking and planning. We recognize today, this is for society and for governments, that the biggest challenges we're wrestling with in public health, in the economy, and energy and climate are increasingly interconnected, increasingly related. We know this now even scientifically. It's not just sort of, you know, a notion or kind of semantic. And in order to wrestle with this, we need to not only use complex system science and networks to see the connections between climate and health, for example, but now we have the data to be able to model that and actually model and manifest the relationships between these different facets of a government. And of course, as businesses are creating new value, as we're creating new amazing things for consumers, there's new revenues that are being created for governments as a result of this. And for society at writ large, we are moving into a moment where data is not the end unto itself. It's not that we've created a data era. It's not that we've created a data revolution. It's that this is the raw material for society to be able to become more scientific about decisions that historically it wasn't able to be scientific about. And we can have great conversation over drinks about the value of scientific thinking. Systemic solutions to global challenges, just taking this idea bigger. We work with the UN on these kinds of questions. And really participatory democracy. If more people can contribute to global processes or global decisions like the Millennium Development Goals by contributing data to those kinds of challenges, we strengthen a global sense of participatory democracy. So this is just a very big picture of where I see the opportunities over the next really handful of years. And this is being enabled, just to kind of frame this, across kind of four major facets of evolution. One in data, in technology, in advanced analytics, and in the applications themselves. And so we know that there's more data. This is not new to us. New types of data, better data infrastructure, newly linked data is at the root of a lot of the stuff that I'll show you. And then within the advanced analytics context, this is being driven by richer machine intelligence, but also very critically and more core to what we think about, newly linked human and machine intelligence, and knowing when to bring the human in and when to lean on the machine for very specific problems. And the examples I'll show will sort of really wrestle with that question. And new algorithms, really as a raw material, as sort of the root of a lot of the things that we're talking about today. Better visualization, stronger data literacy. A lot of this depends on society, on companies, advancing their own data literacy and understanding the questions that we're wrestling with, and more creative and valuable applications. So in order to realize this extraordinary potential, I would sort of argue that we need to think very deeply now and actually architect a sustainable value exchange for this data era. And a value exchange around data which will affect not only kind of people, but their relationship with governments, governments' relationships with companies, companies with society. And once we start to see this and start to see this take shape, we can now start to realize what's the value of producing something like a Beats Music app, or producing something like a Quantified Self app, or producing these kinds of things. If companies are going to ultimately ascribe this kind of value that affects their balance sheets, right? It affects their raw material for innovation, if it affects the way governments make decisions, if we're talking about that level of impact, then we ought to be certain that that value exchange is really rock solid. So I want to kind of frame some of these experiments in value exchange that I've observed that I think are interesting, and then take you to a specific case that we've been excited about. So first, let's just start with between companies and governments, what's starting to take shape. It starts with just policies around making the data available for us to take advantage of. In order for us to make things that are contextually relevant, ultimately we need information about context. And context might be a location, it might be the climate, it might be transportation in that environment. And all of those kinds of things live within government. And we've seen this extraordinary evolution within governments around the world to figure out how to ultimately make this kind of data available and try to ascribe value to it. And we're just at the beginning of starting to figure out what are the economics, what is it worth for government to release this kind of data. So if we want to use that weather data, right, we want to use these kinds of things to be able to create amazing things, what's that value? And what should ultimately government be investing to make these things available to us to take advantage of it? This is an example of something that's already happening. We see O-Power in the US as a classic example, already starting to create value for people, create savings, economic value in their energy bills based on using open and transparent US government data from a number of sources, and already starting to demonstrate that we can create this financial value for people by taking advantage of things that are existing in the public domain. So efforts to start to quantify this are starting, and this is a really critical question for us to resolve, is what is the ultimate value of things that we can be creating here. Between governments and society, so this was an article in the FT a few weeks ago, Britain risks squandering the potential of big data to improve healthcare and advance medical research unless more is done to win public support for the sharing of patient information, ministers have been warned. So this is really critical because if the value exchange, if the perceived value of making health data, for example, is solely that, you know, maybe it's economic or there'll be some sort of targeted ad at you or something like that, and not that we can actually tackle disease differently. We can actually look at relationships between disease and model how disease arises in society, what are the factors that might contribute to disease because we have this extraordinary public health data, whether that's clinical data, genomic data. We've really just begun to observe what is possible scientifically when we have this kind of public health data available or individual patient data anonymized available. But the public hasn't yet understood that. We haven't done a good job of communicating that value back to the public. And so, and clearly we're seeing that. And so if governments, if ministers aren't communicating the value of what we could do, of what kind of questions we can now solve because we have that data, we risk stopping this process, right? This is what we're talking about, right? Suddenly the flows that we're talking about here that we're taking advantage of, stop. People and society. So the UN is thinking about this. The ongoing UN system consultations around the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals that are expiring, the MDGs expiring at the end of this year, the UN has been on a mission to really involve the world in this process, a really grand experiment in participatory democracy, in telling us what's important to you and using that data to drive the political discussions. So Ban Ki-moon said, the ongoing UN system consultations, including my world, have sought the voices of millions and millions of people around the world. So this happens to be a project that we've been privileged to be a part of over the last couple of years, which has to date asked 1 out of every 1,000 people on the planet across 193 countries using a variety of means to tell us a little bit about themselves, their age, their gender, their education level, where they live, and also what are the most important priorities for the next 15 years in terms of development of their countries, whether in health or education or roads or internet access. And all of that data has been assembled into one environment where on a daily basis we're analyzing and exposing those insights to policymakers to inform the political discussions with ministers from those countries as well as with UN agencies. So for the first time, this flow of insight from people into a political process is starting to take shape. And people are giving that basic information, right? We know this is very basic. This is their age, this is their education level, this is their email in some cases, and what's important to them. But still, that flow of information, that sense that something will happen when that data reaches the UN is critical for this kind of a process to be sustainable. Let's move into sort of companies and society. So GSK, which has kind of, I think, been at the forefront of a lot of these questions, has said our commitment to transparency of clinical trial data reflects our wish to help advance scientific understanding and enable the scientific community to learn from the research we've undertaken. When people volunteer for clinical trials, they expect that the results from those trials will be used to help others. We have a responsibility to ensure that happens. So really interesting questions about, again, that expectation that's established at the moment somebody's giving that data to what ultimate what is the ultimate aggregate value that might be created, and companies now wrestling with the value that they're contributing back to society. Okay, so let's move now into sort of people and companies, which will be where we focus for the next few minutes. So in the US, this is a quote from an article in the Times a few days ago. John Hancock, the big insurance provider, is starting to experiment, and this is a quote from one of their leaders. "You do not have to send us any, this is Fitbit data, you are not comfortable with," Mr. Dowdy said. "The trade-off is you won't get points for that." So this is a new experiment, giving their customers Fitbit devices to wear and to send information back to the insurer in the US, and for that to contribute to economics, to points, to rewards, and a kind of gamified system in order to encourage, obviously, healthy living, but clearly to have economic value quite reasonably, fairly back to the insurer. So a new dynamic that's being created and a new sort of microeconomy being created around points based on transfer of that kind of quantified self-data back to the insurer. AT&T, sort of famously in Kansas City, their pilot, when customers choose not to opt in to the premier offer, so a sort of savings that they're enjoying, they will not receive individually tailored advertising, Ms. Schultz said. As described in our privacy policy, AT&T may continue to collect web browsing information for limited purposes such as network management. So if you're going to, as part of the premier offer in Kansas City now, pilot, contribute this browser information, this browsing information to AT&T, you will save money. AT&T will charge a premium on that advertising, generate more revenue from that, and ostensibly, you will enjoy the benefits of tailored advertising. And so the one kind of closest to my heart, this is a tweet. I think most magical thing about the last couple of hours is that Beats Music took me on a tour of myself, reminding me of who I am. Powerful. So let's kind of take this as a kind of jumping off point for a different kind of value that we could be creating, that companies could be creating with data. And how we can ultimately kind of craft relevance very intentionally with this kind of data. So at Seed, we think about this in a lot of contexts. We think about this in music recommendation, crafting relevance, in weather forecasting, in driving experiences at work, and let's sort of hone in on music. But across all of these different contexts, really what we're talking about is the future of personalization. We're talking about how we can ultimately use data to generate contextually relevant recommendations, experiences for people. And this is more than just taking a basket of things and saying which is the right one to give to this big segment of people. This is really about saying at the most granular, high-fidelity level that this is designed for you. Every single aspect of this experience, every single aspect of this experience is designed and tailored for you right now. So when we think about this at Seed, we've sort of plotted this, sort of the y-axis being the generation, and where we are. So if the current generation of personalization and recommendation, which I would argue is where the major services in technology exist today, so how you consume on Amazon, how you get a recommendation on Netflix, how iTunes Genius works today. These are acceptable to us. We've sort of come to realize that a recommendation just has to not be bad, right? Like as long as you get something that doesn't make you laugh, that doesn't sort of isn't off-putting to you, that's considered, a recommendation. That's considered personalized. That sucks. I mean, that's simply inadequate, right? And that's certainly not enough to build a value exchange around. That won't last. So if we think about what does awesome look like? What does this next generation really look like? These are the things that I think about. So one is that it's legitimately trusted, that you genuinely believe that what's being produced for you is the result of some engine that you ascribe some degree of trust to. And it's not simply that it won't get it wrong, but that it is making a conscious effort every single time it's making a recommendation to produce something that earns your trust. And actually think that that's not the currency that we're talking about today. Beyond that is meaningful contextual relevance. We don't all do the same things Saturday nights. We don't all do the same things on a rainy Tuesday morning. And yet we've been led to believe that context is universal, and that ultimately the way we can make things contextually relevant is based on a universal notion of that context. Sunny days means happy, upbeat music. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe some days. Maybe that's the driver of the music, and maybe other days it's something else that's going on that's the driver. So meaningful contextual relevance, not just contextual relevance. That there's a notion of path dependency. When we think about networks, the path within which things are traveling, the flow of things is actually quite critical. And where you were before, this notion of hysteresis in networks, where you were before affects where you go next, loosely speaking. So what we might have presented to you at one moment in time, and your reaction to it, should ultimately affect what happens next. Not just in a kind of learning context, of course within a learning context, but also in terms of maybe a path of discovery, right? So if we're exposing you to some new area of food, some new area of wine that we think is interesting for you, some new part of the world that you should travel to, some new genre of music, the manner in which we're sort of taking you through that journey should be, to some extent, considered, and to some extent, empirical. It should also surprise and delight you. And here's where we do get into sort of good, deep questions of uncanny value. So at one point, do you want something to actually get things wrong? That's okay, right? So in the context of today's way of thinking about recommendation and personalization, if you got a totally laughable result on Amazon, the reaction would be very negative. But maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe if we create a different context for recommendation, getting something wrong would actually maybe be kind of cool. And then finally, this is an asymptote, right? We're never going to get there, maybe, but it's personal. Kind of whatever that means, but it's sort of the sum emergent total of all of those things. So in order to make this happen, we hold dear that this is a blend of big data and extraordinary algorithms and amazing machine learning and great infrastructure, but also just profound empathy. We were very fortunate to be given this brief. This is the brand promise for Beats Music, and when we were brought on by the founders early in the conception of Beats Music and the development of it, this was an idea. This was sort of the essential truth of what Beats Music was going to be about. The right music, and not just the right music, but like magic. That experience would reflect these sort of values that are very consistent with our own at Seed. And so we were very fortunate as we were thinking about these kinds of things at Seed and developing it in different contexts to have this opportunity to work within music. So more concretely, our challenge was to develop algorithms and develop a system that produced the right recommendation for you right now, right here. And to be able to do that as many times a day as you desired, as many times a day as you sort of open that app, and for it to genuinely be responsive to every input you gave it. And not only, again, to be able to do that accurately, but for that experience to feel, we hope, somewhat human. That you felt that there were experts and passionate leaders in music behind that experience. So this is how we kind of tackled this, and I've sort of abstracted this into some of the sort of first principles that we use at Seed to think about crafting this kind of a solution, of crafting relevance with data. So the first is we kind of think about this on two axes of how to think about a problem. in some contexts, and this is about how much human, how much machine. In some contexts, the data that one is working with is actually just simply not human readable. Meaning, if we were to want to interface with it and have access to it and touch it and craft it and tune it, it would be illegible to us, right? So if we were to think about genomic data, it would be very difficult, even for geneticists, to sort of go deep into genetic data and feel a same degree of, let's say, legibility or readability as, for example, the year an album was released. And so the degree to which the domain is human readable is quite significant to the way we think about things. The other is the output that we're producing cultural? Is ultimately what's meant to come out of this something that's going to live in culture, and hopefully you aspire that it will contribute in some small way to culture? And if that's the case, as is the case with music recommendation, well then I kind of want my culture to be touched by people, and I want to know that there's some degree of humanity that went into it, literal humanity that went into it. And I know that if it's a largely sort of human readable space, well then I can create interventions that allow for those humans to actually contribute to the experience and to the recommendations. So this is a kind of framework that we've devised to reflect the way we tackle a problem like this and the way we tackle beats. Is that at the core, we see these domains as human-inspired. How do we ultimately extract the truth, the deep knowledge of a domain expert, whether that's a car designer, a music editor, a wine expert, to ultimately inform what metadata and how algorithms get constructed? Out of something that's profoundly human-inspired, so that we know what we need to manipulate, how the algorithms need to get constructed, what kind of metadata we need to be able to produce the experience, ultimately algorithms are necessary to scale those insights and produce experiences that can work for millions and millions of people and work in real time and work in runtime systems. So ultimately this needs to get scaled somehow algorithmically. But then once it's algorithmically scaled, we see the opportunity for humans to come back into that equation and actually tune, actually manipulate the algorithm itself and use visualization and use interaction design to allow for that direct manipulation of the ultimate experience. And then finally, because machines are really good at picking up kind of errors that humans make, really critical here is to define what an error is, to my earlier point about not getting everything just right, but that aside, it's really valuable for algorithms to then play the role of sort of that extra check and balance on the human. And we, in our architecture, sort of see the algorithm as finally making that judgment, because again, if you are doing things for millions and millions of people, ultimately there are advantages to sort of leaning on the machine for certain things. But only sort of if and only if the architecture is as structured as such. Then that algorithmic evaluation feeds back into the human tuning so that we can constantly inform and refine and improve the manner in which humans are tuning any of these kinds of algorithms. And finally, we think about this in multiple dimensions of taste. So we know about preference, right? So clearly it's natural in the context of personalization recommendation to think about your preference for a certain kind of wine or your preference for a certain kind of music and to make that contextual, but also your behavior. And this is maybe the most interesting kind of frontier for us right now, is the manner in which you're experiencing things, the trends, the patterns that we can observe in what lies beneath the surface of your explicit manifestation of preference is really quite profound. And that too is subject to context. So there's so many facets to this story, and there was a great Wired article that articulates a lot of sort of the magic that I sort of will turn to. But a lot of the challenges are things like overcoming cold start in recommendation systems. So how do we begin a problem where we know nothing about you, sort of a traditional problem in recommendation systems? And in the context of Beats, we worked closely with RGA as working on sort of the front end, the UI and the UX, to create an experience where every moment at the very beginning of onboarding into Beats Music contributed very intentionally to how we started to seed your profile and understand what general area of music was appealing to you. And this is designed in a learning context so that every time you're telling us something, we are intentionally choosing what we're giving back to you to inform what we give to you next, to try to get closer and closer to an understanding of your taste very, very rapidly, mindful of sort of the design constraints of just user experience, that we have to sort of crack this somewhere, somehow in 30 seconds, 45 seconds, or you'll tune out. And ultimately, that's designed to project what we're learning about you onto this very complex map of music that we produce, so that we can start to sort of associate general areas that we know for sure we want to orient to, areas that we don't know yet, areas that we think maybe are worth experimenting with, and then we can start ranking things like that. We observe everything. And so deep observation, which requires deep big data engineering and the ability to capture and store all of this, and working with great engineers at Beats to do that, to be able to capture so many dimensions of every time you are interacting with music, every time you're playing and skipping and turning up the volume and all of these things, where you are, the time of day, the day of the week, lat long, all of that kind of stuff is contributing to our richer and richer and richer understanding of your taste. No one single data point in any of these contexts for us is deterministic. Just because we have one thing is never going to be a sort of binary sense, okay, that's, you don't like country, or you don't like Cabernet, you don't like red cards, but is giving us some extra piece of information to contribute to ultimately the experience we're producing for you. And over and over and over time, we get more and more confident, and we can know to what extent we're confident in any of those predictions that we're making for the experience we're creating. This is fuzzy intentionally, but what you can see here is sort of behavior modeling in two very different contexts. Really, the purpose of me putting this up there is to say that part of what we think about, and I think is really deeply interesting, is to observe at the most granular level how somebody interacts with something, how somebody ultimately comes to discover something new. How did they get to that new artist, that new genre that we had no idea they would get to? We couldn't have predicted that. How did they ultimately discover that, again, that new food, right, that new ingredient? And being able to actually visualize, and we use interaction design to help us, in data visualization to help us really start to craft a rich understanding of you at the most individual level, so that then we can aggregate those insights up. Now, the most interesting frontier for us, and I'll sort of leave it there, is what happens when you can use these kinds of insights, so behavior, and not just preference, but use behavior to actually drive the way you start segmenting and understanding customers, understanding consumers. So this is hyper sort of frontier work for us in a number of different contexts to start crafting algorithms that allow us to use behavior data, so actually how you drive the car, how you listen to the music, to start to organize people into very true micro segments that allow us, of course, not only to construct relevance and product experience, but you can imagine profound implications for CRM, for marketing, for all sorts of substantial economic questions that affect companies. But it allows people to, through that exchange of value, demonstrate who they are very truthfully, and hopefully allow companies to confront this very revolutionary sort of set of insights, which is that the way in which they've organized people before may not be the truest, most profound way of organizing them in the future. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Proper brain food, wasn't it, that one? Blimey. I'm not sure about time. Have we got time for a question? Yes. Does anyone have a question? Adam, you want to? We have
I was very interested to see the future of personalization. It got me thinking, so people will probably spend less time searching for information as their needs will be fulfilled when they arise. So probably people will probably make less decisions. If that is the case, what do you think, what impact this will have on the society, making less decisions?
I don't know that that follows. I'm not sure that you would say that the quantity of decisions ultimately, that the quantity of decisions necessarily correlates with that. So the nature of decisions will necessarily change as a result of what you're sort of positing. We will make less decisions about certain kinds of things. But hopefully the result of that is that we can expend more time making the higher level, more complex decisions that we are ultimately very well suited to make as humans. So that's what I would anticipate. I mean, it's a little bit more of a glass half full perspective, but I would hope that the result is that now we can think about the relationship between a vote that we make and how that affects society, as opposed to just, should I eat this now?
I see. Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
Hi. You talked around preference and behavior. Was there a point where you started in your data analysis to see a very clear diversion or a deviation between preference and behavior, and over what time? Because one of the things that we struggle with is obviously we want to have our customers tell us how we should be communicating with them, and obviously try to learn more over time. But did you see a point where you could actually react to behavior in a much more intelligent way, which overrode or overrides their preference behavior initially, or their stated preferences initially?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I'd say that we're just kind of on the cusp of testing out where to lean on behavior, where to lean on preference in various contexts. What I will say is that what led us to the hypothesis that we needed contextual behavior to sort of sit alongside contextual preference is that we recognized that many aspects of taste that we were noticing in the rich user data that we have couldn't be characterized based on the sort of somewhat simplified, but necessarily simplified view that comes from just organizing things based on preference. So there is something that is beneath the surface of how we explicitly manifest our preference, that we just, first of all, there's definitely a sort of observation that led to that then allocation of resource to study that. But as a scientist, I'm also, and as a scientifically oriented culture as a company, that's just our propensity. And so curiosity sort of leads us there, that we know that this is just not good enough, and that there is a whole other frontier to be able to, for sure, characterize people better, right? It's for sure an incredible part, but we had enough sort of observational data to guide us to ultimately work with clients to convince them that how you change lanes matters, and not just that you drive fast.
As a quick add-on to that, then, do you capture the macro variables at the point of stated preference as well, and link that through to how that might influence what they're stating their preference as at the minute, if that makes sense. So if at the point of, say, opting into a particular service.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to study what people say is their sort of interests in things, and then to observe sort of how that differs, and kind of why it differs and when it differs. I mean, just to observe that sort of delta is interesting, but actually to start studying why people in various contexts, right? Beats has a feature called the sentence, where you can sort of choose who, what, when, why, where kind of thing. And you know, part of our studies when we were working with music editors was really uncovering how being with other people versus saying you were, you know, in bed on your own listening to indie would confer something different, right, to that experience, or that desired experience, right? If you're sort of on the street with your friends kind of thing, does being in that kind of public domain, as an easy example, affect real preference versus stated preference?
I just wondered if you were afraid. I don't know if I need to fill that in, it's probably obvious, but the world that we create is pretty counterintuitive to the idiocy of humans, which is the beauty of humans. And I wonder where you sign up on the sort of Elon Musk dystopian 5 years we'll all be robots, to my theory that humans are just too sneaky to ever really fall for this, and they'll escape in some way.
I think there's an important distinction when the lens through which you sort of look at things is science and not technology. If I was a technologist, which I'm not, a sort of endless optimism for the impact of technology would, I think, quite substantially cloud my judgment about where to be optimistic and where to be pessimistic about people and society. As a scientist, there are no truths. Everything's an asymptote. I'm hyper-skeptical about everything, and by nature, culturally. And so I think what this moment, you know, writ large, is affording us is the ability to really take smaller steps and build evidence for what happens when we do certain things, and to allow for that evidence to, in aggregate, to hopefully contribute to some bigger transformation in society about how we think about ourselves, how we look at ourselves, how we think about society, how we think about our relationships between people. And I'm optimistic that the net outcome of this moment, insofar as to the extent that we ultimately construct this kind of value exchange, because I'm mostly afraid that people don't see real value from the flow of their data out into companies or society or government, and it's pre-regulated and over-regulated prematurely, and then that's it. We've sort of lost a moment that isn't a moment about, you know, just trillions of dollars of economic value that are going to be created it's not that. This is deep and profound, this transformation. And I'm deeply optimistic that, I mean, I've spent the last decade plus more broadly thinking about how to advance kind of scientific thinking and a kind of scientific culture in society that's not deterministic, that's not reductionist, that blends humanities, that blends artistry, that blends all those other things into it. And I really am quite optimistic that this moment is what will spur that. That now we have the raw material to do that and to be more scientific, not technological, be more scientific, if and only if we get this right.
Brilliant. Well, when the robots do come, I'm going to be on your side. Great. Well, give it up for Adam.